everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York as the shockwaves ripple throughout the Middle East from Donald Trump's deadly strike against Iran's brutal former leader of the Quds Force. There is tectonic plate shifting impeachment news today. John Bolton, the president's former national security advisor, who reportedly described the Ukrainian pressure campaign as a drug deal, and Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, who remains in the middle of the effort to push the Ukrainians for investigations into the Bidens as a grenade who would blow everybody up, announcing today that he will testify in a Senate impeachment trial if he's subpoenaed. Bolton, either playing for U.S. national security interests or for the history books or both, has, in the absence of any legal ruling forcing his testimony, examined the separation of powers questions himself and offered to testify before the Senate. 71% of Americans would like to hear from witnesses like Bolton, and it will only take 4 Republicans to side with Democrats on the question of hearing from Bolton for a vote to subpoena him to pass the Senate. Knowing Bolton for the better part of 2 decades, it's a decent bet that he just might know where 4 votes to hear from a first-hand witness might be hiding. From Bolton's stunning announcement today, news broken by NBC's own Carol Lee, quote, the House has concluded its constitutional responsibility by adopting articles of impeachment related to the Ukraine matter. It now falls to the Senate to fulfill its constitutional obligation to try impeachments, and it does not appear possible that a final judicial resolution of the still unanswered constitutional questions can be obtained before the Senate acts. Accordingly, since my testimony is once again at issue, I've had to resolve the serious competing issues as best I could, based on careful consideration and study. I've concluded that if the Senate issues a subpoena for my testimony, I am prepared to testify. And reporting in the New York Times indicates that testimony from Bolton might pose a threat to Donald Trump's standing in the impeachment fight. From the Times, quote, former White House officials and people close to Bolton have indicated that his testimony would likely be damning to Mr. Trump and put additional pressure on moderate Republicans to consider convicting him. That bombshell is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. The aforementioned NBC News correspondent Carol Lee, who broke this news. Phil Ruckers, the White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. Former chief of staff at the CIA and the Department of Defense, Jeremy Bash, is here. With us at the table, former chief spokesman for the Justice Department, Matt Miller's back, and former Department of Justice prosecutor Andrew Weissman joins us. Carol Lee, we'll start with you. Take us through the origins, if you will, of this John Bolton decision.
Well, Nicole, if you want to go back to when this was still under consideration of whether or not the House would subpoena Bolton and he would testify there, his position was, I will not testify unless I'm subpoenaed and a court rules in my favor, saying I have to testify. At the same time, what we heard from his lawyer was these sort of tantalizing bits about that suggested he really wanted to testify, that he knew things that hadn't yet come out publicly, that, you know, he was present for things that perhaps, you know, the House Intelligence Committee was unaware of as yet. And so all the while, so he was waiting for this court decision, but all the while kind of saying, look, I'm here if you want to talk to me. And the House decided thanks, but no thanks. And they didn't do that. And so according to Bolton's statement, he then went back and looked at these constitutional issues himself and just decided that he can testify and that in fact the only one who has absolute immunity from congressional testimony is the president himself. And so he is now saying he's willing to do that, and that he would, you know, essentially serve as a witness in the Senate trial. And that, I got to tell you, has the White House a little bit on edge for all the reasons you said. They've really feared his testimony because of everything that he knows. And so the real question is, A, whether there's several. One, whether Mitch McConnell will actually subpoena Bolton, and this will come to pass. And B, if he does, what would he say that's new, and is that persuasive enough? Or is just the optics of having John Bolton, who, as you just said, has been a figure in Republican politics for decades, testifying to the facts that we've heard others testify to, and does that have an impact on some of these more moderate Republicans? Those are the questions that we just don't have answers to right now, but he's willing to do it.
Carol Lee, I've described John Bolton this way, and if you disagree, please jump in. You've covered him and sort of his sphere of national security issues for a long time. But he is to conservative foreign policy what Scalia was to conservative judicial thought and policy. The idea that he could be smeared the way the Republicans smear Colonel Vindman, that he could be dismissed as hysterical the way they sought to smear Yovanovitch and Fiona Hill, as abhorrent as that was, is just not the case with Bolton. He is a conservative's conservative. He's in good standing among Fox News hosts, with the exception of Tucker Carlson, who's sort of a Rand Paul isolationist. And the idea that he examined, I mean, there is a 3-year record now of stonewalling Congress. There is more sort of cover for not showing up on Capitol Hill than there is rationale, legal or political or anything else, for walking up there. What other than national security interests and concerns about Donald Trump's foreign policy conduct would propel a decision like this from Bolton?
Well, I think that if you look at John Bolton's someone who has a lot of interest in, and he's a kind of an Article 2 nerd. He likes these constitutional questions or things that he's thought about for some time. So there's that piece of things. There's also just the piece of that he saw things that we all know, according to people who spoke to him about it, that he was uncomfortable with, that he disagreed with, and that he thought were wrong. And some of them were being carried out by people that, frankly, he didn't like and he didn't get along with while he was in the White House, and namely Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And so clearly, he would have a lot to say about whatever roles those two had and what his knowledge of that is. And whether there's anything new there, we don't know. But presumably, there's a real possibility that there is. In terms of just him and being who he is and being unable to be smeared by the Republicans in this same way. You know, John Bolton has a super PAC, and that super PAC is supporting some of the senators who will be jurists in this trial. And, you know, so his ties with the party are deep, that he's not somebody that they're going to easily be able to distance themselves from. And based on all my reporting, what John Bolton would intend to do if he goes in there is just simply tell the truth of what he saw and what happened. And as we've seen, when you get other individuals who have witnessed these sorts of things, that what happened with the Ukraine matter, when they say it out loud, when the cameras are on, and it can sound, you know, it can be quite damning for whoever he is speaking about, and to have John Bolton do that takes it to a totally different level.
So just telling the truth, Phil Rucker, would include either corroborating the testimony already on the record from multiple Bolton deputies, or basically calling them liars and describing their testimony as false, which there's no indication in anyone's reporting today that that's his plan. So what's already on the record from Fiona Hill and others really goes to concerns about the illegality of the Ukraine scheme. It's been corroborated in all the recent reporting from your newspaper, from the New York Times. Let me play some of the legal concerns that have been testified to being concerns that Bolton had.
A specific instruction was that I had to go to the lawyers, to John Eisenberg, our senior counsel for the National Security Council, to basically say, you tell Eisenberg, Ambassador Bolton told me, that I am not part of this whatever drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland are cooking up.
What did you understand him to mean by the drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland were cooking up?
I took it to mean investigations for a meeting.
Did you go speak to the lawyers?
I certainly did.
Did you tell Ambassador Bolton about this conversation as well?
I reached out to him as well and requested his availability for a secure phone call.
And what was his response when you explained to him what Ambassador Sondland had said?
Tell the lawyers.
Phil Rucker, we know what kind of lawyer Donald Trump wants. He wants his Roy Cohn. He seems to have that in the Attorney General. But it certainly brings the lawyers that all of the national security folks who John Bolton sent upstairs to the lawyers, if they're still on the second floor, into this conversation as well. And if John Bolton is willing to say absolute immunity isn't a thing, I wonder how many other people will follow him up to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, Nicole, that's a really good point.